The park was a sanctuary of calm in the middle of the city's chaos, where pigeons pecked at breadcrumbs, and the distant hum of traffic served as background noise. Jonathan Hale, a man whose presence commanded attention, walked briskly through it. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the pavement as he checked his watch, the afternoon sun reflecting off his pristine silver Rolex. Jonathan was at the peak of his power, CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech firm, known for his ruthless business acumen and his ability to turn anything into gold. But despite his success, there was something hollow inside him, a gnawing emptiness that lingered just beneath the surface, like an itch he couldn't scratch. He rarely had time for reflection, moving from one deal to the next, constantly chasing more. As he neared the park's exit, a sound pierced through his thoughts, a melody, soft but unmistakably familiar. It floated through the air like a whisper from the past, pulling at the edges of his memory. His steps slowed, and against his better judgment, he turned toward the sound. A street musician sat on an overturned milk crate at the corner of the path, hunched over a battered acoustic guitar. His clothes were tattered, and his face obscured by a hood, but the music was painfully familiar. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be. The musician strummed a hauntingly beautiful tune, each note plucking at a forgotten corner of Jonathan's soul. It was the same melody he hadn't heard in decades, something only one person could have played. Jonathan froze, unable to move, his mind racing back to a time long before the wealth, before the corporate boardrooms, back to when life was simpler. The melody was Lucas's. "Impossible," Jonathan whispered under his breath, his pulse quickening. He hadn't seen Lucas in over 20 years, not since that night. The night he had made the choice that would change both their lives forever. He had chosen ambition over loyalty, wealth over friendship, and in doing so, he had betrayed the one person who had stood by him through thick and thin. Lucas was supposed to have moved on, or so Jonathan had thought. But here, in front of him, was the tune they had written together in the cramped basement of a college dorm. A melody that symbolized their dreams, their bond, and ultimately, their fracture. Jonathan took a tentative step closer, his breath catching in his throat. The musician, still unaware of his audience, continued to play, eyes closed, lost in the rhythm. When the song ended, Jonathan stood motionless, staring, trying to reconcile the image of the man before him with the vibrant, full-of-life Lucas he had once known. Then, the musician looked up. For a split second, their eyes met, and Jonathan's chest tightened. Under the grime, the street-worn face, and the years of hardship etched into every wrinkle, Jonathan saw it. Those same intense blue eyes that had once belonged to his best friend. Lucas. His heart pounded in his chest. He should turn away. He should leave before Lucas could recognize him. After all, what could he possibly say after all these years? Sorry wasn't enough. Nothing could undo what he had done, but he couldn't move. Suddenly, Lucas's eyes clouded, his body swaying slightly. Jonathan watched in horror as Lucas stumbled, the guitar slipping from his grasp. In a split second, Lucas collapsed onto the sidewalk, unconscious. Panic surged through Jonathan as he rushed forward, kneeling beside Lucas's limp body. His mind was a whirlwind. Memories of their shared youth, the betrayal, and the life he had left behind. But all that vanished as the immediate concern took over. His best friend, the man he had wronged, lay crumpled before him, fragile and broken. "Help!" Jonathan yelled, waving for someone to call an ambulance. As a small crowd began to gather, Jonathan cradled Lucas's head, his heart pounding with fear and guilt. How had things come to this? How had Lucas, once so full of life, so talented, ended up here, a shadow of his former self, playing music on the streets? The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, but Jonathan's mind was already elsewhere, spiraling into the past. He had thought his betrayal was behind him, buried beneath years of success and power. But now, here it was, staring him in the face, reminding him of the price he had paid, and the even greater price Lucas had suffered. As the paramedics arrived and lifted Lucas onto a stretcher, Jonathan stood, still in shock, torn between guilt and fear. There were too many questions, too many emotions colliding inside him, but one thing was clear. This moment would change everything. Watching the ambulance doors close, Jonathan made a decision. He wasn't going to run this time. Lucas needed help, and Jonathan was the one who owed it to him. The cold fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room hummed above Jonathan, a stark contrast to the chaos of thoughts swirling in his mind. He sat motionless, staring at the sterile white walls, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the weight of the past that now pressed heavily on him. Lucas was in the emergency room, being tended to by doctors, but Jonathan's mind was far away, back in a different time. 2 decades ago, when their lives had been completely intertwined. They had met in college, 2 young men with nothing but raw ambition and dreams bigger than their small-town roots. Jonathan had come from a modest family, his father a factory worker and his mother a seamstress. Lucas, on the other hand, had been a natural talent, an artist in every sense of the word. He could play any instrument, write music that could make anyone pause, and had a way with people that Jonathan had always envied. Back then, they had been inseparable. Their dorm room had always been filled with music, Lucas's guitar strumming in the background while Jonathan worked on whatever business idea was brewing in his mind. Together, they had formed a plan. Jonathan would handle the business side, Lucas the creative. They'd start a music production company, one that would change the industry forever. It was their dream, but dreams had a way of fading. As Jonathan's focus shifted more and more to the business world, the partnership began to strain. Lucas wanted to create, but Jonathan wanted power, success, and most of all, money. And then came the moment that would sever them for good, the moment when Jonathan saw an opportunity, one that would launch his career, but it required him to betray Lucas. The door to the emergency room swung open, pulling Jonathan out of the painful flashback. A doctor approached, her face neutral, though Jonathan searched for any sign of bad news. "Are you the patient's family?" she asked, glancing down at the clipboard in her hands. Jonathan hesitated. Family? Once, perhaps, they had been as close as brothers. Now, he was just the man who had taken everything from Lucas. He cleared his throat. "No, I'm a friend." The doctor nodded, flipping through her notes. "Your friend is severely malnourished and dehydrated. We've stabilized him, but he's been living in harsh conditions for some time. There's no permanent damage, but it's clear he hasn't had consistent care or proper nutrition. He'll need rest and treatment for a while." Jonathan exhaled in relief, though the guilt gnawed at him even deeper. This was his fault, at least, that's how it felt. If he hadn't betrayed Lucas, if he hadn't chosen his ambition over their friendship, maybe Lucas wouldn't have ended up like this. "Can I see him?" Jonathan asked quietly. The doctor nodded. "He's still unconscious, but you can sit with him for a while. He'll likely wake up soon." Jonathan followed her down the hall, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. What would Lucas say when he opened his eyes? Would he recognize him? Would he even want to see him after all these years? They entered a small hospital room, the beeping of machines providing a steady rhythm in the background. Lucas lay on the bed, pale and gaunt, a far cry from the vibrant young man Jonathan remembered. His once proud posture was now slumped, his face lined with the wear of a hard life. Jonathan stood at the edge of the bed, the weight of 2 decades crashing down on him. He had built a fortune, an empire, but at what cost? Looking at Lucas now, he couldn't help but wonder. Was all his success worth the price of losing his best friend? The image of Lucas playing on the street haunted him. How long had he been there? How long had he suffered while Jonathan lived in luxury? His thoughts drifted back to the day of the betrayal. It had been a pivotal moment in both their lives. Jonathan had been approached by a powerful investor, a man who could take their fledgling music idea and turn it into a massive success. But there had been a catch. The investor wasn't interested in working with Lucas. He didn't see the value in the artistic vision Lucas held so dear. Jonathan had been given a choice: walk away with Lucas or seize the opportunity and leave his friend behind. Jonathan had made the wrong choice. He had gone behind Lucas's back, cut him out of the deal, and taken the money. From that day forward, Jonathan's rise had been meteoric. And Lucas? Jonathan had no idea what had happened to him after that. Until today. Hours passed, and Jonathan remained at Lucas's bedside, staring at his old friend, hoping for some sign of recognition. Finally, as the afternoon light began to dim, Lucas stirred. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused. Jonathan leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Lucas," he whispered, not knowing what to expect. Lucas blinked slowly, his gaze settling on Jonathan. For a long, tense moment, there was nothing, just the cold, sterile air between them. Then, confusion crossed Lucas's face. Who are you?" Lucas asked, his voice weak. The question hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. He had prepared himself for anger, for hatred, for some kind of confrontation. But this? Lucas didn't even recognize him. I'm a friend," Jonathan lied, the words catching in his throat. How could he explain everything now? The guilt was too heavy, and he wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. Lucas nodded slightly, too tired to question further. His eyelids drooped, and soon he was asleep again. Jonathan slumped back into the chair, running a hand through his hair. The shame burned in his chest, but he knew he couldn't leave it like this. He couldn't walk away again, not this time. As he watched Lucas sleep, Jonathan made a silent vow to himself. He would help Lucas in any way he could, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to atone for the betrayal that had shattered both their lives. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor echoed softly in the room as Jonathan sat in silence. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Lucas, his once vibrant best friend now a fragile shell of the man he used to be. It had been 2 days since Jonathan had found Lucas collapsed in the park, and though the doctors assured him Lucas would physically recover, the emotional toll of the years lived on the streets was evident in every line on his face. The guilt that weighed on Jonathan was suffocating. He had built an empire on the foundations of their shared dream, a dream that he had stolen. Every dollar he had made, every deal he had closed, was tainted by that betrayal. And now here Lucas was, living in poverty, reduced to playing music on the streets, while Jonathan had lived in luxury. The disparity made Jonathan sick to his stomach. Lucas stirred, and Jonathan instinctively sat up, watching as his old friend blinked awake, his gaze still hazy from sleep. There was a moment of recognition. Lucas's eyes scanned the room, then landed on Jonathan. For a second, Jonathan thought Lucas might remember him, but the confusion returned. Where am I?" Lucas asked, his voice raspy and weak. "You're in the hospital," Jonathan said softly, pulling his chair closer to the bed. "You collapsed in the park. I found you and brought you here. You were in pretty bad shape." Lucas looked away, staring at the ceiling as if trying to piece together fragmented memories. "Hospital," he murmured, as though the word was foreign to him. He turned back to Jonathan, his brow furrowing. "Who are you again?" Jonathan hesitated. For a moment, he wanted to come clean, to admit who he really was, to confess his betrayal and beg for forgiveness. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. The fear of what Lucas might say, of the hatred that might flash in his eyes, paralyzed him. "My name's Jonathan," he said instead, carefully omitting his last name. "I was passing by when I heard you playing. Then I saw you collapse. I couldn't just leave you there." Lucas studied him, his eyes narrowing as if trying to connect the dots in his mind. "Jonathan," he repeated slowly, the name not quite registering with the gravity it should have. Jonathan's stomach clenched, waiting for any sign of recognition, but none came. Lucas's memories of him were buried deep, lost beneath years of hardship. Jonathan felt a small, shameful relief. He wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. He wasn't ready to face the consequences of what he had done. Why are you helping me?" Lucas asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. "I don't know you." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, struggling to find the right words. I couldn't just walk away. You needed help." Lucas seemed unconvinced, but he was too tired to argue. "I don't need charity," he muttered, turning his head away. "I'll be fine. You don't need to stick around." "It's not charity," Jonathan replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "Think of it as a favor. We all need help sometimes." Lucas let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Help, right." Jonathan felt the sting of those words. He wanted to explain. wanted to tell Lucas that he owed him so much more than help. But how could he possibly begin to explain the years of betrayal and guilt that lay between them? He cleared his throat. You can stay with me until you get back on your feet. I have a place, plenty of room. You don't have to worry about a thing. Lucas shook his head. I can't. I don't need some rich guy taking pity on me. There was a sharpness in his voice, a sense of pride that hadn't been beaten out of him despite everything he had gone through. Jonathan leaned forward. It's not pity, Lucas. I want to help. At the sound of his name, Lucas's head snapped toward Jonathan. His eyes widened slightly, as though he was only now realizing that this stranger knew more about him than he had let on. The air between them grew thick with tension. How do you know my name? Lucas asked, his voice now laced with suspicion. Jonathan froze. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for a response. He could feel the lie he had told already beginning to unravel. He should have been more careful, should have hidden his knowledge of Lucas, but the familiarity had slipped out. I heard someone call you that in the park, Jonathan lied quickly, hoping Lucas wouldn't press the issue. Lucas's expression softened slightly, though the suspicion didn't entirely leave his eyes. He was too weak to argue, too drained to question further. I don't need your help, he said again, quieter this time, as if trying to convince himself more than Jonathan. Let me do this, Lucas, Jonathan pressed, feeling desperation seep into his voice. I don't know why, but I feel like I owe it to you. Lucas stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. The silence stretched, the beeping of the machines filling the space between them. Finally, Lucas sighed, the fight draining from him. Fine, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Just until I can get back on my feet. Jonathan exhaled, relieved. But even as Lucas reluctantly accepted his offer, Jonathan knew that this was only the beginning. The truth about who he really was and what he had done loomed over him like a dark cloud, threatening to crash down on them both. 2 days later, Lucas was discharged from the hospital. Jonathan had arranged for a car to take them back to his mansion, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, far removed from the grim reality Lucas had been living. As they pulled up to the grand gates of the estate, Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This is your place? He asked, glancing out the window at the manicured lawns and towering stone walls. Jonathan nodded. It's home. Lucas snorted softly. Some home. You must be doing pretty well for yourself. Jonathan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Yeah, you could say that. But every ounce of his success felt like a weight around his neck, heavier now with Lucas beside him. The mansion, the wealth, it all seemed meaningless in the face of what he had lost. They pulled up to the front entrance, where the staff had been instructed to give them privacy. As Lucas stepped out of the car, his gaze lingered on the grandeur of the estate, but his eyes were distant, as if he couldn't quite reconcile where he was with the reality of his own life. Inside, Jonathan led Lucas to a guest room. This is yours for as long as you need, he said, gesturing to the lavish space. It felt hollow to offer luxury when what Lucas had really needed all these years was loyalty, friendship, and support. Lucas said nothing, simply nodding as he sat down on the edge of the bed. His expression was unreadable, but the tension between them was palpable. Jonathan knew that no matter how much wealth or comfort he offered, it wouldn't make up for the past. As Jonathan left the room, he paused at the door, looking back at Lucas. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. Lucas didn't look up, only nodded again. Thanks, he muttered, though the word felt empty. Jonathan closed the door behind him, the weight of his guilt heavier than ever. He had saved Lucas's life, but that wasn't enough. Not yet. The real act of redemption would be far more difficult. When Lucas finally remembered who he was and what Jonathan had done to him. And when that time came, Jonathan wasn't sure if he'd be able to face it. Days passed in a tense, quiet rhythm. Lucas had settled into the guest room of Jonathan's mansion, his recovery slow but steady. He was physically gaining strength, but there was a palpable distance between them, an unspoken wall that seemed to grow with each passing day. Jonathan could feel it, and every interaction reminded him of the time bomb ticking between them. Lucas still didn't recognize him, but that didn't make things any easier. If anything, it made Jonathan feel even guiltier. He was hiding in plain sight, pretending to be a stranger while secretly knowing every inch of Lucas's history, his hopes, his dreams, all the things he had helped destroy. The weight of his unspoken confession bore down on him with every awkward conversation and every meal they shared in silence. One evening, after dinner, Jonathan found Lucas sitting on the porch overlooking the sprawling garden, strumming a guitar Jonathan had brought from his music room. The melody was soft, melancholic, and achingly familiar. It tugged at a buried part of Jonathan's soul, reminding him of the days when he and Lucas would stay up late writing songs, imagining the life they would build together. Jonathan approached slowly, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You play beautifully," he said, his voice quiet. Lucas didn't stop playing, though his lips twitched into a faint, almost sad smile. "I used to," he murmured. "I don't know if I still have it in me anymore." Jonathan took a seat next to him on the porch step, the tension between them heavy. "You haven't lost a thing," he replied. "It's all still there." Lucas looked at him, his fingers still moving over the strings. His eyes were tired, worn down by years of hardship, but there was something else, an old pain that Jonathan recognized too well. It was the same pain he had seen in Lucas's eyes the night he had betrayed him, the night he had walked away from their friendship for a career that had left Lucas in the dust. "I haven't played in years," Lucas said, breaking the silence. "There wasn't much reason to, I guess. Not after everything fell apart." Jonathan's heart clenched. He didn't dare ask what Lucas meant by everything, though he had a feeling he knew. It was his betrayal, the moment that had shattered their shared dream and sent Lucas spiraling into the life he now lived. "What happened?" Jonathan asked, treading carefully, not wanting to push too hard but needing to know. He had to understand how deep the damage went. Lucas was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the garden beyond. "I used to have a lot going for me," he said quietly. "A best friend, a future in music. We had plans. Big ones." Jonathan swallowed, his mouth dry. This was it, the beginning of the conversation he had been dreading. "What happened to him?" Jonathan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Your friend." Lucas's fingers paused on the guitar strings, and a bitter laugh escaped his lips. "He betrayed me," he said simply. "Took everything we worked for and turned his back on me. I thought we were in it together, you know? I trusted him. But in the end, I was just someone standing in the way of what he really wanted. Money, success." Jonathan's chest tightened as the words cut through him like a knife. The truth was out, even if Lucas didn't know it yet. The guilt that had been gnawing at him for years felt unbearable. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas looked at him, his eyes hardening slightly. "You don't need to apologize. You didn't do it. But yeah, it messed me up. I spent years trying to pick up the pieces. Couldn't get back into the industry. No one wanted to work with me. It was like everything I had been building toward just vanished overnight." Jonathan stared at the ground, his mind swirling. He had always assumed that Lucas had found some other path, that maybe he had moved on and rebuilt his life. But hearing the truth, hearing that Lucas had been left with nothing, made Jonathan feel sick. "And your friend?" Jonathan asked carefully, unsure if he could handle the answer. Lucas's gaze drifted back to the horizon. "I haven't seen him since. I don't know if I'd want to." He sighed heavily. "Part of me hates him for what he did, but another part of me, I don't know, I miss him sometimes. We were like brothers once. I guess it's stupid to miss someone like that after what he did." Jonathan felt a lump forming in his throat. Lucas's words were a brutal reminder of everything he had destroyed. Not just a business opportunity, but a friendship, a bond that had been as close as family. "It's not stupid," Jonathan said softly. "Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones we care about the most." Lucas didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He was lost in his own thoughts, the pain of his past still raw and unresolved. The two of them sat in the growing darkness, the weight of old wounds hanging in the air between them. Jonathan wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But what could he possibly say? How could he explain the betrayal, the greed that had overtaken him, the years of guilt that had followed? Finally, Lucas broke the silence. I guess it's just me now, he said quietly, a trace of bitterness in his voice. No use holding on to the past, right? Jonathan wanted to scream. He wanted to tell Lucas that it wasn't just him, that he was here, that they could somehow rebuild what had been lost. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not when Lucas didn't know the truth. Instead, he nodded. Yeah, he said, his voice hollow. I guess so. But even as he said it, Jonathan knew it was a lie. The past wasn't something either of them could escape, and as much as he wanted to make things right, he wasn't sure if Lucas would ever forgive him once he learned the truth. The next morning, Lucas was up early, wandering the grounds of Jonathan's estate. He seemed restless, as if being in such a place of wealth and comfort only made him more aware of everything he had lost. Jonathan watched him from the window, the guilt twisting inside him like a knife. He knew he couldn't keep the truth hidden forever. Lucas deserved to know, even if it destroyed whatever fragile trust they had left. Later that day, as they sat for lunch, Lucas spoke up, his tone more determined than it had been before. I've been thinking, he said, pushing his food around his plate. I appreciate everything you've done, Jonathan, but I can't stay here much longer. I've got to figure out what's next for me. I've been down too long, and it's time I get back on my feet. Jonathan felt a pang of anxiety. He wasn't ready for Lucas to leave, not before he had a chance to make things right. You don't have to go anywhere yet, Jonathan said quickly. You're still recovering. There's no rush. Lucas shook his head. I've been thinking about this for a while. I need to figure out what's next, even if that means starting from nothing. I'm not the kind of person who can just sit around. Jonathan's heart raced. He knew that if Lucas left now, there might never be another chance to tell him the truth, to try and repair what had been broken. He had to say something, even if it terrified him. Lucas, Jonathan began, his voice unsteady. There's something I need to tell you. Something about me. About us. Lucas frowned, his fork pausing midair. What do you mean? Jonathan swallowed hard, the moment of truth crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He could feel the fear tightening in his chest, but he knew he couldn't run from it anymore. I wasn't honest with you, Jonathan continued, his voice shaking. I wasn't just some stranger who found you in the park. Lucas's eyes narrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? Jonathan took a deep breath. You know me, Lucas. You used to know me better than anyone. Lucas's face was blank for a moment, and then, slowly, understanding began to dawn. His eyes widened in shock, the color draining from his face. I'm the one, Jonathan said, his voice barely a whisper. I'm the one who betrayed you. The silence that followed Jonathan's confession was suffocating. It stretched long and heavy between them, as if the weight of his words had sucked all the air from the room. Lucas sat frozen, his fork still in his hand, his eyes wide with disbelief. Jonathan could see the storm of emotions swirling behind them. Shock, confusion, and then, slowly but surely, a dawning anger. Jonathan's pulse raced as he waited for Lucas to say something, anything, to break the unbearable quiet. He had finally told the truth, but now the moment felt more terrifying than he had ever imagined. Lucas set his fork down, the metallic clink sounding deafening in the stillness. He stared at Jonathan, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. His face hardened, and when he did finally speak, his voice was low and filled with barely contained fury. What did you say? Lucas asked, his tone dangerously calm, as if he hadn't heard correctly or didn't want to believe it. Jonathan swallowed, the knot in his throat tightening. I'm the one who betrayed you, he repeated, his voice shaking. All those years ago. The business deal, the investor who turned you away. It was me. I made the deal without you. I took it all. Lucas stared at him, his jaw clenching, the muscles in his neck tensing. You, what? His voice trembled now, the hurt slowly surfacing behind the anger. You did this to me? You're the reason I've been living on the streets? You're the reason my life fell apart? Jonathan's heart sank. Hearing Lucas say it out loud, confronting the reality of what he had done, was worse than anything he could have imagined. He had spent years telling himself that Lucas would be fine, that Lucas would land on his feet. But now, staring into the eyes of the man whose life he had destroyed, Jonathan realized the full extent of the damage. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said, his voice thick with regret. "I was young, I was greedy, and I thought I needed to prove something, to myself, to the world. I made the worst mistake of my life, and I've lived with that guilt ever since." Lucas shook his head, disbelief and anger battling for control. "Guilt?" he spat. "You think guilt changes anything? You think it erases what I've been through?" Jonathan felt his chest tighten as the guilt he had carried for so long finally erupted into full view. "I know it doesn't," he said quietly. "I can't undo what I did, but I can try to make it right now." Lucas stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the floor. He began pacing, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Make it right?" he repeated, incredulous. "How the hell do you think you can make it right? You stole my entire future from me. You left me with nothing." Jonathan stood too, though he stayed where he was, knowing that approaching Lucas might only make things worse. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted, his voice trembling, "but I want to try. I owe you that much, Lucas." Lucas turned on him, his eyes blazing with fury. "You owe me everything," he shouted. "I trusted you, Jonathan. We were like brothers. And you didn't just walk away. You destroyed me." Jonathan winced at the harsh truth in Lucas's words. "I know," he said softly, "and I can't undo that. But I'm not the same person I was back then. I've had time to think, to realize what I've done, and I want to help you now, in whatever way I can." Lucas let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Help me? You think throwing some money at me is going to fix this?" Jonathan shook his head. "No, it's not about money. I want to help you rebuild your life. Whatever you want to do, I'll support you. If you want to get back into music, I'll fund a studio. If you want to start something new, I'll be there. It's not about the money. I want to be there for you this time, the way I should have been before." Lucas stopped pacing, his back turned to Jonathan. He stood still for a moment, his shoulders tense. "It's too late for that," he muttered, his voice filled with a deep, bitter sadness. "You can't just walk back into my life and think everything's going to be fine. You think you can buy my forgiveness? My trust?" Jonathan took a step closer, but he stopped short, not wanting to push Lucas further. "No," he said firmly. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I want to give you the chance to get back what you lost. You're too talented to be living on the streets. You deserve better." Lucas turned to face him, his expression unreadable now, the anger and hurt simmering beneath the surface. "I don't need your charity," he said, his voice low. Jonathan shook his head. "This isn't charity, Lucas. It's restitution. I took everything from you, and I can't erase that. But I can try to give something back." Lucas stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Jonathan's face as if looking for a sign of sincerity. "And what do you get out of this?" he asked, his tone suspicious. Jonathan hesitated, but he knew he had to be honest. "I don't get anything," he said, "except maybe the hope that I can live with myself. That maybe, one day, you can look at me and not see the man who betrayed you." Lucas crossed his arms, his gaze still wary. "You're asking for a lot," he said quietly. "I know," Jonathan replied, "and I don't expect you to trust me right away. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm here, and I'm not walking away this time." Another long silence stretched between them, the tension thick. Jonathan could see the conflict in Lucas's eyes, the anger, the pain, but also something else, something that looked like the faintest glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure if Lucas would ever be able to forgive him, but for the first time in years, Jonathan felt like he was doing something right. Finally, Lucas let out a slow breath. "Fine," he said, his voice tired. "You want to help? Then help me. But don't think for a second that this makes us even. You have a lot to make up for." Jonathan nodded, relief flooding through him. "I know, and I will." The days that followed were awkward and tense, but Jonathan was determined to keep his promise. He reached out to his contacts in the music industry, carefully selecting those who hadn't been involved in the original betrayal. He arranged meetings, set up opportunities, and did everything he could to give Lucas a chance to get back on his feet. But all the while, there was a quiet distance between them. an unspoken understanding that forgiveness was far from guaranteed. Lucas, true to his word, didn't treat Jonathan with anything resembling warmth. He accepted the help, but he kept his walls up, his bitterness still palpable. They were two men living in the same house, but the chasm between them was wide. One afternoon, Lucas sat in the sunroom, strumming his guitar while Jonathan worked nearby. The tension was ever present, but Lucas seemed to have softened, if only slightly. His music filled the air, reminding Jonathan of the days when they had dreamed of making it big together. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan allowed himself to hope that, maybe, they could find a way forward. But Lucas's guard was still up, and Jonathan knew that the journey to redemption would be long and difficult. There would be no quick fixes, no easy solutions. He had destroyed something precious, and no amount of money or effort could bring it back. All he could do was keep trying, hoping that, with time, Lucas might find it in his heart to forgive him. And if not, at least Jonathan could say that he had tried to make amends. But as the days passed, Jonathan began to realize that redemption wasn't just about Lucas. It was also about himself, about facing the man he had been and the choices he had made. And maybe, just maybe, if he could do that, he might finally be able to forgive himself. The tension between Jonathan and Lucas hung like a thick fog in the mansion, never dissipating, always present. Although Lucas had begrudgingly accepted Jonathan's help, he kept his distance, his words sharp and guarded. Jonathan had expected it, knew that trust, if it ever returned, would take time. But he hadn't anticipated how much the weight of their unresolved past would bear down on them both. Days turned into weeks, and while Lucas spent most of his time practicing music or meeting with industry contacts Jonathan had set up, there was an invisible wall between them. They shared the same space, exchanged polite conversation, but underneath it all was the bitter truth they both knew. Jonathan had destroyed Lucas's life once, and no amount of wealth or support could erase that. One afternoon, while Jonathan was working in his study, he heard the faint strum of Lucas's guitar echoing from the other side of the house. It was a haunting tune, one that Jonathan recognized all too well, a melody they had written together in their youth. It sent a chill through him, bringing back memories of simpler times, when their future had seemed bright and their bond unbreakable. Unable to focus on his work, Jonathan stood and wandered toward the sound of the music. He found Lucas sitting by the window in the sunroom, his head bent over the guitar, lost in the rhythm. Jonathan lingered in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt, but before he could decide, Lucas spoke without looking up. "I remember when we wrote this song," Lucas said, his voice low, almost contemplative. "I haven't played it in years." Jonathan took a hesitant step into the room. "It was one of our best," he said softly. "I always thought it would be the one that got us noticed." Lucas glanced up, his eyes shadowed with old pain. "Yeah, well, we never got the chance, did we?" The unspoken truth lingered in the air. Lucas had never gotten the chance because Jonathan had stolen it from him. Jonathan felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on his chest, but before he could respond, Lucas turned his attention back to the guitar, his fingers idly plucking at the strings. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music filled the silence, a bridge between them that felt fragile, like it could break at any moment. Jonathan longed to say something, to explain once again how sorry he was, but he knew words weren't enough. Not now, not after everything. After a few minutes, Lucas set the guitar aside and stood. "I need to clear my head," he muttered, brushing past Jonathan as he left the room. Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had been trying so hard to fix things, but it felt like they were stuck in place. Lucas was still a stranger in his own home, and Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper going on, something Lucas wasn't telling him. Later that evening, Jonathan found himself wandering through the halls of the mansion. It had been his home for years, but it felt different now. The grandeur of the place, the marble floors, the priceless art, seemed hollow, especially with Lucas there, a constant reminder of the emptiness Jonathan had been trying to fill with wealth and success. As he passed by the door to Lucas's room, something caught his eye. The door was slightly ajar, and from his vantage point, Jonathan could see Lucas's guitar leaning against the bed, next to an open suitcase. Curiosity tugged at him, but he hesitated. He didn't want to invade Lucas's privacy, but something in the scene didn't sit right. He stepped closer, peeking inside the room. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. There, on the bed, was a photograph. It was old, faded around the edges, but unmistakable. A picture of the two of them from their college days. They were smiling, arms slung around each other's shoulders, full of the confidence and optimism of youth. Jonathan had a copy of the same photograph in his office, tucked away in a drawer he hadn't opened in years. Next to the photo was something else, an envelope, its edges worn from being opened and closed many times. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. The envelope looked oddly familiar, like something from the past he couldn't quite place. Before he could stop himself, Jonathan stepped into the room. He reached for the photograph, his fingers trembling slightly as he picked it up. He stared at the image, remembering the day it had been taken, back when he and Lucas had been inseparable. They had been so close, so certain that nothing could come between them. And yet, here they were, strangers in the same house, barely able to speak without the shadow of betrayal hanging over them. Suddenly, the door creaked open behind him. Jonathan whipped around, dropping the photo back onto the bed. Lucas stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What the hell are you doing in here?" Lucas's voice was cold, but there was something else in it, something darker, more guarded. Jonathan raised his hands defensively. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I just saw the photo and—" "Get out," Lucas snapped, cutting him off. Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but the look in Lucas's eyes made him stop. There was fury there, yes, but also pain, deeper than Jonathan had ever realized. Without another word, he turned and left the room, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked down the hall, Jonathan's mind raced. Why had Lucas kept that photograph? And what was in the envelope? There was something Lucas wasn't telling him, something from the past that still haunted him, and Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to their shared history. But what? The following morning, Lucas was gone. Jonathan had expected him at breakfast, but there was no sign of him. He checked the guest room and found it empty. The suitcase was gone, the guitar missing. Panic rose in Jonathan's chest as he searched the house, calling Lucas's name, but the silence that greeted him at every turn told him all he needed to know. Lucas had left. Jonathan rushed outside, hoping that Lucas hadn't gone far, but as he stepped onto the driveway, he saw nothing but the empty stretch of road leading away from the mansion. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the estate, and for the first time, Jonathan felt truly alone. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring down the road, hoping that Lucas would somehow reappear. But deep down, he knew the truth. Lucas was gone, and this time, he might never come back. Jonathan's mind raced as he replayed the last few weeks, searching for a clue. Anything that might explain why Lucas had left so suddenly. His thoughts kept returning to that photograph, to the envelope, to the way Lucas had looked at him in the doorway. There was something more, something Lucas hadn't told him, and now Jonathan feared that he had lost his chance to ever find out. But then, just as he was about to give up, something caught his eye. There, on the porch step, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. Jonathan walked over and picked it up, his hands trembling as he unfolded it. It was a note, written in Lucas's familiar scrawl. "I thought you should know why I'm leaving. There are some things I need to deal with on my own. I've been carrying something with me for years, and I'm not sure if I'll ever be free of it. But you were right about one thing. I do deserve better. And maybe one day, I'll figure out how to forgive you. But not today. There's something you should see. I left it in your study. It's time you knew the whole truth." Jonathan's heart pounded as he crumpled the note in his hand, fear and curiosity warring inside him. What had Lucas left for him in the study? And what was the truth that he had been hiding all this time? With shaking hands, Jonathan turned and headed back inside, toward the study where his past, and perhaps his future, awaited. Jonathan's hands trembled as he pushed open the heavy oak door to his study. The room was as it always had been. Shelves lined with leather-bound books, dark mahogany furniture, and a massive desk that had once been the center of his empire. But today, it felt different, heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. His heart raced as his eyes scanned the room, searching for whatever it was that Lucas had left behind. The note in his hand crinkled as he clutched it tighter, the words replaying in his mind. "There's something you should see. I left it in your study." What could it be? What had Lucas been hiding all this time? Then he saw it, a small, nondescript envelope sitting on his desk. It was the same envelope he had seen in Lucas's room the night before, worn and faded, as though it had been carried for years. Jonathan's stomach churned as he approached it, dread pooling in his chest. With a shaky breath, he reached for the envelope and carefully pulled out its contents. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded multiple times. As Jonathan unfolded it, his eyes immediately landed on something that sent a shockwave through his entire body. It was a letter. A letter addressed to Lucas from over 2 decades ago, right around the time of their falling out. The letter was from her. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he read the name at the top of the page. Sophie, the woman they had both loved. His hands shook as he read the letter, the words slowly tearing apart everything he thought he had known about the past. "Dear Lucas, I've been trying to figure out how to say this for weeks, and I can't hold it in any longer. I know we said we wouldn't let this get complicated, but I can't pretend anymore. I love you. I've loved you for a long time, but I was too scared to admit it. I'm sorry for how I've acted, keeping my distance, not letting you in. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to Jonathan either. He doesn't know about us, and I don't know how to tell him. You two are like brothers, and I'm terrified of coming between you. But we can't keep this secret forever. I need to see you. We need to talk. Please meet me at the place by the river, the one where we used to go when things got too loud. I'll be there tomorrow at sunset. We'll figure this out together. Love, Sophie." Jonathan's head spun as he finished reading the letter. His chest felt like it had been punched, the wind knocked out of him. Sophie and Lucas? His mind reeled with the implications. He had loved Sophie, or at least, he thought he had. But she had been with Lucas, in love with Lucas, while Jonathan had been too blind to see it. He staggered backward, his hand gripping the edge of the desk for support as memories flooded back. Sophie had been the one thing that had kept them all together. Her warmth, her smile, her easy way of making everything seem less complicated. Jonathan had never known that she and Lucas had been involved, that they had shared something so deep and hidden. He hadn't known, but Lucas had, and now it made sense. The letter explained everything. Why Lucas had been so distant in those final days before the betrayal. Why he had disappeared so completely after the business deal fell through. Jonathan had stolen more than just Lucas's career. He had unwittingly stolen the woman Lucas had loved. But why hadn't Lucas said anything? Why had he kept this secret for all these years? Jonathan sank into the chair behind his desk, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a crushing wave. He had spent years thinking his betrayal had been purely professional, an act of ambition and greed. But now, he realized that it was far more personal, far more destructive than he had ever imagined. For Lucas, it wasn't just about losing the business deal. It was about losing everything. His best friend, his career, and the woman he had loved. And now, after all these years, Lucas had dropped this final bombshell, leaving Jonathan to grapple with the truth. Jonathan's mind raced, replaying the past over and over. Had Lucas left because of the letter? Was that why he hadn't confronted Jonathan directly about Sophie? Was the betrayal too deep, too personal, to ever forgive? 1,000 questions swirled in Jonathan's head, but the answers were elusive. He was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, anger, confusion, and the walls of his mansion felt like they were closing in on him. He needed to talk to Lucas, to understand why he had kept this secret for so long. But Lucas was gone. That night, Jonathan barely slept. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the letter replaying in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about Sophie, about the connection she had shared with Lucas, a connection Jonathan had been too self-absorbed to notice. He had always believed that his betrayal had been about ambition, about power. But now, he realized that it had been about much more. The next morning, Jonathan woke with a sense of grim determination. He couldn't leave things like this. He couldn't let Lucas disappear without confronting the truth head-on. Lucas had given him this letter for a reason. He had wanted Jonathan to know the full extent of the damage he had caused, and now Jonathan had to face it. There was only one thing to do. He had to find Lucas. Jonathan spent hours calling every contact he had, trying to track Lucas down. But it was as though Lucas had vanished into thin air. None of the music industry people he had connected Lucas with had heard from him. The staff at the mansion hadn't seen him leave, and none of the places Jonathan thought Lucas might have gone had any sign of him. Frustration gnawed at Jonathan's gut. He had never been one to let things slip out of his control, but now, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. His thoughts were consumed with Lucas, his anger, his pain, and the fact that Jonathan had only now begun to understand the depth of the betrayal. By the end of the day, Jonathan was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He had scoured every avenue he could think of, but Lucas was nowhere to be found. He returned to the mansion, defeated, and sat down in the study, the letter still lying on the desk where he had left it. As he stared at it, a sudden thought occurred to him. Sophie's letter mentioned a place by the river, a spot that had been special to her and Lucas. Jonathan hadn't thought about that place in years, but now it came flooding back to him. It was a small, secluded area by the riverbank, where they had gone when they needed to get away from the pressures of life. Without wasting another moment, Jonathan grabbed his keys and headed for the door. He had a feeling that Lucas would be there, that he was waiting for Jonathan to find him. The truth had finally come out, and now there was only one place they could face it, at the place where it had all begun. The drive to the riverbank felt like it took forever, though in reality, it was only about an hour outside the city. Jonathan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped down the highway, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. He didn't know what he would find when he got there, whether Lucas would even be willing to talk to him. But he had to try. He owed Lucas that much. When he finally arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the water. The air was cool, the sound of the river flowing gently in the background. Jonathan parked the car and stepped out, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape, searching for any sign of Lucas. And then, he saw him. Lucas was sitting on a large rock by the water's edge, his back to Jonathan, his head bowed as if lost in thought. The sight of him, so alone, so still, made Jonathan's heart ache. He walked toward him, the gravel crunching under his shoes, and as he approached, Lucas looked up, his expression unreadable. Jonathan stopped a few feet away, unsure of how to begin. "I got your note," Jonathan said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Lucas didn't say anything at first. He just stared out at the water, his face hard and closed off. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost tired. "I figured you would," Lucas muttered, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "I thought you needed to know everything. Not just about the business, but about Sophie." Jonathan took a deep breath, the name Sophie hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you tell me back then?" he asked, his voice thick with regret. "Why didn't you say anything?" Lucas turned to face him, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "What was I supposed to say, Jonathan? That the woman we both loved chose me? That she wanted to be with me, not you? You would have hated me." Jonathan shook his head, the guilt rising in his throat like bile. "I wouldn't have. I wouldn't have hated you. I would have understood. We were friends, Lucas. You should have told me." Lucas's jaw tightened. "It wasn't that simple. I thought I was protecting you. I didn't want to come between you and Sophie, and I didn't want to destroy our friendship. But in the end, none of it mattered, did it? You took everything from me anyway." Jonathan felt the full weight of Lucas's words slam into him. He had been blind, too consumed by his own ambition to see the truth that had been right in front of him. He had betrayed Lucas in more ways than one, and now, the consequences of those actions were staring him in the face. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Lucas. I didn't know. I was selfish, and I destroyed everything. I can't take it back, but I'm asking you now, can we try to fix this? Can we find a way to move forward?" Lucas was silent for a long time, his gaze still fixed on the river. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was a hardness to it that cut through Jonathan's hope. "I don't know if we can, Jonathan," Lucas said. I've carried this for too long. Maybe some things can't be fixed. Jonathan's heart sank. He had expected anger, expected resistance, but hearing Lucas say it so plainly, that maybe their friendship was beyond repair, felt like the final blow. I want to try, Jonathan said, desperation creeping into his voice. Please, Lucas. I don't want to lose you again. Lucas stood slowly, turning to face Jonathan fully. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something Jonathan couldn't quite place. We'll see, Lucas said quietly, but don't expect forgiveness to come easy. You've got a lot to make up for. Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. He had expected nothing less. As they stood by the river, the sun dipping below the horizon, Jonathan realized that this was just the beginning. There would be no quick path to redemption, no simple way to heal the wounds of the past. But for the first time, they were both standing in the same place, facing the truth. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward after all. Jonathan stood by the river, watching the last rays of the setting sun dip below the horizon. The quiet rush of the water and the cool evening air felt like a strange contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Lucas's words echoed in his mind. Don't expect forgiveness to come easy. You've got a lot to make up for. Jonathan knew it would be a long, painful road, but at least they had spoken the truth. The weight of the past no longer hung between them unspoken. But now that the truth was out, what came next? Jonathan wasn't sure if Lucas would ever fully forgive him, or if he even deserved it. But one thing was clear. He had to try. The next few days passed in a blur. Lucas returned to Jonathan's mansion, but the tension was ever present, and neither of them spoke about their conversation at the river. Lucas kept to himself, continuing his work with music, while Jonathan dove back into his business, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. Yet, beneath the surface, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was looming, a shadow creeping closer. That shadow had a name, Adrian Shaw. Adrian had been Jonathan's business partner for years. They had made a fortune together, but Jonathan had always known that Adrian was ambitious, dangerously so. Adrian was the type of man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, and recently, he had been pushing Jonathan toward a high-stakes investment that didn't sit right with him. It was a deal that promised massive returns, but the more Jonathan looked into it, the more he realized how risky it truly was. There were whispers of fraud, of backdoor dealings, and Jonathan couldn't afford to have his reputation tied to something so shady. He had worked too hard to rebuild his life, especially now, when he was trying to make amends with Lucas. One evening, as Jonathan was reviewing the latest reports in his office, his phone buzzed. Adrian's name flashed on the screen. Jonathan, Adrian's voice was smooth, slick with the charm that had made him such a dangerous ally in business. I've got some news about that deal we've been discussing. I need you to meet me tomorrow to finalize things. Jonathan's stomach twisted. He knew what Adrian was talking about, the deal, the one he had been avoiding. Adrian, I've been thinking about that, and I'm not sure it's the right move. There's too much at stake. There was a brief pause, and when Adrian spoke again, his voice had a sharper edge. You're not backing out, are you? Because that would be a shame, considering everything we've built together. I thought we were partners. Jonathan could feel the threat behind the words. Adrian wasn't a man who took kindly to disloyalty, and he had the power to make Jonathan's life difficult if he chose. But Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that this deal was a trap, something that could ruin everything if it went south. I'm just being cautious, Jonathan said carefully. We need more time to look into the details. I don't want us to get burned. Adrian let out a low chuckle. Jonathan, you've always been the cautious one. That's why we work so well together. You take care of the details, and I make sure we keep moving forward. But this deal? It's a game changer. I need you on board. Jonathan's mind raced. He knew Adrian was right about one thing. The deal could be a game changer, but it could also be a disaster, and if it blew up, Jonathan would lose more than just money. His reputation, his business, and even his fragile relationship with Lucas could all be at risk. I'll think about it, Jonathan said finally, his voice tense. But I'm not ready to commit yet. Don't take too long, Adrian warned, his tone dropping. Opportunities like this don't wait forever. The call ended. leaving Jonathan with a sinking feeling in his gut. He couldn't trust Adrian, but walking away from the deal could mean losing everything he had worked for. And if Adrian decided to retaliate, Jonathan knew it could get ugly. Later that night, as Jonathan sat in his study, still reeling from the conversation with Adrian, Lucas walked in. He paused in the doorway, hesitant, as if unsure whether to speak. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Lucas said, his tone guarded but not unkind. Jonathan forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just business," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes it feels like no matter how far I've come, there's always something waiting to pull me back down." Lucas raised an eyebrow and stepped farther into the room. "Something shady?" Jonathan hesitated. He had never spoken to Lucas about his business dealings, not in detail anyway. But after everything that had happened, Jonathan felt the urge to be honest. Lucas, of all people, knew what it was like to be betrayed, and Jonathan wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the facade of control. "There's a deal on the table," Jonathan admitted. "Big money, big risks. My partner, Adrian, wants me to sign off on it, but I've got a bad feeling about it. I think it's dirty, fraudulent, maybe worse. But if I walk away, Adrian's going to come after me. He's not the kind of guy you cross without consequences." Lucas leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "So, what are you going to do? Sign up and hope it doesn't blow up in your face? Or walk away and deal with whatever Adrian throws at you?" Jonathan sighed. "I don't know. If I make the wrong choice, I could lose everything." Lucas was silent for a moment, then spoke, his voice thoughtful. "I know what it's like to lose everything, Jonathan. And I know what it's like to be burned by someone you trust. If you think Adrian's going to screw you over, he probably will. And when it happens, you'll be the one left holding the bag." Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. He had always admired Lucas's ability to cut through the noise and get to the heart of things. Even after everything that had happened between them, Lucas still had a way of seeing the truth that Jonathan sometimes couldn't. "So you think I should walk away?" Jonathan asked, though deep down, he already knew the answer. Lucas shrugged. "It's your decision. But if you want my opinion, don't sign anything until you're sure you can live with the fallout. You've already lost me once because of a bad decision. Don't lose everything else, too." Jonathan felt a stab of guilt at Lucas's words. It was a painful reminder of how much he had already sacrificed for ambition, how much damage he had done in pursuit of success. The deal with Adrian could be his ticket to even more wealth, more power. But at what cost? "I can't let him take me down," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not after everything I've built." Lucas gave him a long, measured look. "You don't have to. But maybe it's time to stop building something you don't even believe in anymore." Jonathan stared at him, the weight of Lucas's words settling deep inside him. He didn't believe in this deal, didn't believe in Adrian's promises. But fear had kept him tethered to it. The fear of losing everything, of starting over, of admitting that his ambition had led him down a dangerous path once again. Lucas stood and moved toward the door. "Think about it, Jonathan. You're at a crossroads. Just make sure you don't end up on the wrong side of it." From Adrian's deal were filled with an uneasy calm, like the stillness before a storm. Jonathan knew Adrian well enough to understand that he wouldn't let this go easily. Adrian Shaw was not a man who accepted defeat. Jonathan had rejected the deal, and in doing so, had placed himself in direct opposition to one of the most ruthless businessmen he had ever known. Despite the looming threat, Jonathan felt a strange sense of relief. He had made the right choice, finally putting integrity over profit. Lucas's words had stayed with him. Don't sign anything unless you can live with the fallout. And Jonathan had realized he couldn't live with the kind of consequences Adrian's deal would bring, no matter how much money was involved. But now, as days turned into weeks, Jonathan found himself bracing for Adrian's inevitable retaliation. One night, as the city lights twinkled in the distance and the mansion's halls were bathed in soft lamplight, Jonathan sat in his study, reviewing business reports. His focus was fractured, his mind drifting back to the danger Adrian posed. Just as he was about to call it a night, his phone buzzed, the screen flashing with an unknown number. His stomach tightened. "Adrian." With a sigh, Jonathan answered. "Jonathan," came Adrian's voice, cold and clipped. I've been trying to reach you. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, tension knotting his shoulders. There's nothing more to discuss, Adrian. I made my decision. Adrian's voice darkened. Your decision, Jonathan, has consequences. I warned you. Walk away from me, and I'll make sure you regret it. Jonathan's jaw clenched. He had expected this. I'm not afraid of you, Adrian. I've dealt with worse. A low chuckle rumbled through the line. You think you're safe? You think your empire is untouchable? I'm not coming for your money, Jonathan. I'm coming for everything. Your reputation, your company, your life, all of it. I know all about the skeletons in your closet. Jonathan's breath caught. He had been meticulous, careful not to leave any trail that Adrian could use against him. But Adrian's words sent a shiver of dread down his spine. What did he know? How deep did his reach go? Before Jonathan could respond, Adrian continued. Let's not pretend this is just about the deal. This is about power. You turned your back on me, and now, I'm going to make sure you watch everything crumble around you. Jonathan's hand tightened around the phone. You're wasting your time. Am I? Adrian's tone was laced with menace. I've already started making moves. I hope you're ready to play, because this game is going to end very badly for you. The line went dead. Jonathan slammed the phone down, his heart racing. He had expected retaliation, but not like this. Adrian wasn't just coming after him financially. He was threatening to tear down everything Jonathan had built, to destroy his name and reputation. Jonathan had spent years cultivating his image, rebuilding after his betrayal of Lucas, and now it all hung in the balance. The next day, chaos erupted. Jonathan woke to find news headlines splashed with allegations against his company. Rumors of fraud, embezzlement, and corporate corruption. Reporters hounded him at his office, demanding answers. Stockholders panicked, and the value of his company plummeted. Adrian had made his move, and it was more devastating than Jonathan had anticipated. Inside the boardroom, his executives were in a frenzy, frantically trying to contain the damage. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, barely able to focus on their panicked chatter. His thoughts kept circling back to Adrian's final words. I know all about the skeletons in your closet. What skeletons? His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from an unknown number. Jonathan's blood ran cold as he opened it. Meet me at the river. Tonight. No name, but Jonathan didn't need one. He knew it was Adrian. That night, under the cover of darkness, Jonathan drove to the riverbank. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the water. The place had once been a symbol of friendship and shared dreams, but now it felt like a battlefield. Jonathan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he parked the car and stepped out into the cool night air. Adrian was waiting for him by the water, his silhouette dark against the pale moonlight. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but Jonathan could feel the tension radiating off him. Good to see you, Jonathan, Adrian said, his voice smooth and dangerous. Enjoying the chaos I've created for you? Jonathan approached, stopping a few feet away. What the hell do you want, Adrian? You've already made your point. Adrian's smile was cold, predatory. Oh, this isn't about making a point. This is about winning. And right now, I'm winning. Jonathan's jaw tightened. You think destroying my company is going to give you what you want? You're playing with people's lives, Adrian. This isn't just business. Adrian shrugged, unbothered. Everything is business, Jonathan. You should know that by now. But this isn't just about your company. It's about you. You've always been the golden boy, haven't you? Everyone loves Jonathan Hale, the self-made man, the success story. But I know the truth. I know about Lucas. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Lucas's name. What about him? Adrian stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. I know how you betrayed him. I know what you did. And now, I've made sure that the world will know too. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. You're bluffing. Adrian laughed softly, a sound that chilled Jonathan to the bone. Am I? The story is already in motion. By tomorrow morning, everyone will know that Jonathan Hale isn't the hero they think he is. You stole from your best friend, ruined his life, and built your empire on his back. And now, your empire is going to burn. Jonathan's mind raced. Adrian had always been dangerous, but this was personal. He had found out about Lucas, about the betrayal that had haunted Jonathan for years, and now he was using it as a weapon to destroy him. "What do you want, Adrian?" Jonathan asked, his voice hard. Adrian's smile widened. "I want everything. I want your company, your wealth, your power, and I want you to watch as I take it all from you." Jonathan clenched his fists, rage boiling beneath the surface. "You're not going to get away with this." Adrian raised an eyebrow, his expression mocking. "Aren't I?" "You're already losing, Jonathan. Your company is crumbling, your reputation is in ruins, and your old friend Lucas, well, let's just say he won't be too happy when the truth comes out." Jonathan's pulse quickened. He had to stop this. He couldn't let Adrian destroy everything, not just for himself, but for Lucas. He had already caused Lucas enough pain. He couldn't let this betrayal be dragged into the public eye. "I'll fight you," Jonathan said, his voice low and determined. "I'll take you down, Adrian." Adrian chuckled, turning to leave. "Good luck with that, Jonathan. By the time you figure out how to fight back, it'll be too late." As Adrian walked away, disappearing into the shadows, Jonathan stood by the river, his mind spinning. Adrian had drawn the battle lines, and now it was up to Jonathan to fight back. But how? Adrian's reach was vast, and the damage had already begun. Jonathan's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. This time, it was Lucas. "We need to talk. Now." Jonathan stared at the message, dread pooling in his stomach. He knew what was coming. Lucas had seen the news, had heard the rumors. The confrontation he had been dreading was finally here. An hour later, Jonathan sat across from Lucas in the mansion's living room. Lucas's face was tight with anger, his fists clenched in his lap. He had clearly seen the headlines, and now, the truth Jonathan had been trying to protect him from was laid bare. "So it's true," Lucas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Everything Adrian said. You used me. You built your empire by stabbing me in the back." Jonathan met his gaze, guilt tightening his chest. "Lucas, I can explain." "No," Lucas interrupted, standing abruptly. "You don't get to explain. I trusted you, Jonathan, and you took everything from me." Jonathan stood as well, his heart pounding. "I was wrong, Lucas. I know that now. I've been trying to make it right ever since." "Make it right?" Lucas spat, his eyes blazing with fury. "You can't make this right. You took everything. My career, my future, Sophie, everything." The mention of Sophie hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. "Lucas, I didn't know about Sophie. I didn't know how much I hurt you." Lucas's expression twisted with pain. "You never cared. You were so focused on your success, on winning, that you didn't care who you crushed along the way." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. "I care now, Lucas. I've spent years trying to fix this. I didn't want you to find out like this, but Adrian, he's using our past to destroy both of us." Lucas's eyes flashed with anger. "You destroyed me long before Adrian came along." Jonathan reached out, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, Lucas, don't let Adrian tear us apart again. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to make things right. We can stop him together." Lucas stared at Jonathan, his face hard and unreadable. For a long moment, the tension between them was unbearable. Then, finally, Lucas let out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping. "You've got a lot to make up for, Jonathan," he said quietly. "But if Adrian thinks he can use me to destroy you, he's got another thing coming." Jonathan felt a surge of relief. "You'll help me?" Lucas nodded, though his expression was still grim. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I won't let that bastard use me to take you down. But don't think for a second that this means we're good." Jonathan nodded, knowing that forgiveness was still a long way off. But for now, they had a common enemy. And if they were going to survive this, they would need each other. As the two men stood in the shadow of their shared past, the battle against Adrian was just beginning. The early morning fog clung to the city streets as Jonathan stood in the shadow of his office building, staring up at the towering structure that had once been a symbol of his success. Now, it felt like a fortress on the brink of collapse. Adrian had made his move, and the fallout had been swift. The media had latched onto the scandal. Investors were fleeing, and Jonathan's company was teetering on the edge of ruin. But Jonathan wasn't going down without a fight. Beside him, Lucas stood silently, his face unreadable. Jonathan glanced at his old friend, wondering if Lucas would ever truly forgive him. They had formed a fragile truce, agreeing to take down Adrian together, but Jonathan knew that the betrayal still hung between them. Lucas had every right to hate him, and even now, Jonathan wasn't sure if they could ever repair what had been broken. But for now, they had a common enemy. "We're really doing this?" Lucas asked, breaking the tense silence. Jonathan nodded, his jaw set. "We don't have a choice. Adrian won't stop until he destroys everything." Lucas's gaze hardened. "Then let's make sure he doesn't get the chance." The plan had come together quickly. Jonathan and Lucas knew that the only way to defeat Adrian was to expose him, fully and publicly. Adrian had built his own empire on a foundation of lies and deceit, and if they could reveal his illegal dealings, it would bring him down for good. But it wasn't going to be easy. Adrian had covered his tracks well, and they needed concrete proof to take him down. That's where Lucas came in. Years of living on the fringes of society had taught Lucas how to be resourceful, how to find information in places no one else would think to look. While Jonathan had been working to rebuild his empire, Lucas had developed a network of contacts, people who knew things, people who had access to the underbelly of the business world. And now, those contacts were going to help them gather the evidence they needed. "We've got a lead," Lucas said one evening, sitting across from Jonathan in the mansion study. He tossed a file onto the desk. "Adrian's been laundering money through shell companies overseas. We can trace it all back to him." Jonathan flipped through the documents, his heart racing. "This is it. This is enough to take him down." Lucas nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his expression. "It's not over yet. Adrian's going to fight back hard when he realizes we're onto him." Jonathan's stomach twisted with dread. Adrian wasn't the type to go down quietly, and Jonathan knew that the closer they got to exposing him, the more dangerous things would become. But this was their only chance. "We need to make this public," Jonathan said, closing the file. "Once the world knows what Adrian's been doing, he won't be able to hide behind his power anymore." Lucas leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "There's one more thing," he said carefully. "Adrian's been talking to the press. He's planning to release everything he knows about you and me. The betrayal, Sophie, all of it. He's going to use our past to drag you through the mud." Jonathan's chest tightened. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel all the more real. Adrian wasn't just going after his business. He was going after his soul. And once the media got hold of the story, there would be no escaping the fallout. Lucas watched him closely, his expression unreadable. "What are you going to do?" Jonathan stared at the documents in front of him, the weight of his past pressing down on him. "I'll tell the truth." Lucas raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You're willing to air all your dirty laundry? Admit to the world what you did?" Jonathan nodded, though fear gnawed at him. "If I don't, Adrian will control the narrative. I've spent my whole life running from the truth, but it's time I own up to it. I betrayed you, Lucas, and I've spent years trying to bury that, but I can't run from it anymore." Lucas was silent for a long moment, his eyes locked on Jonathan's. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's take him down." The press conference was set for the following day. Jonathan stood in front of the mirror in his office, adjusting his tie, his reflection a man who barely recognized himself. He had been preparing for this moment for days, but the reality of what was about to happen weighed heavily on him. Once he stepped in front of those cameras, there would be no going back. Lucas entered the room, his expression grim. "It's time." Jonathan took a deep breath and followed Lucas out of the office. As they walked through the halls of the building, employees whispered and stared. The rumors had been swirling for weeks, stories of scandal, betrayal, and impending downfall. Now, they would all know the truth. When they reached the press room, the buzz of reporters filled the air, cameras flashing as Jonathan and Lucas took their places at the podium. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall, ready to face the consequences of his past. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "I've built my career on the image of success, on the idea that hard work and determination can lead to greatness. But today, I stand before you to tell the truth. My success was built on a lie. The room fell silent, the reporters hanging on his every word. Years ago, I betrayed my best friend, Lucas, Jonathan continued, glancing at Lucas, who stood beside him, stoic and strong. I stole from him, and I used that betrayal to launch my own career. I've spent years running from that truth, but now, it's time for me to face it. I am not the man I pretended to be. There was a murmur in the crowd, cameras flashing as Jonathan spoke. I'm also here today to expose someone who has been hiding in the shadows, manipulating and deceiving. Adrian Shaw, my former business partner, has been involved in illegal activities, laundering money through shell companies, and using his power to exploit those around him. We have the evidence, and we're going to make sure he's held accountable. Jonathan gestured to Lucas, who stepped forward, holding up the documents they had gathered. The reporters surged forward, shouting questions, but Jonathan ignored them, his focus solely on Lucas. I've caused a lot of pain, Jonathan said, his voice heavy with emotion. But today, I'm choosing to stand with the truth. Lucas and I have both been used, both been hurt, and it's time for us to take back control. As the press conference continued, Jonathan felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of his guilt, his shame, had been lifted. He had told the truth, and now, whatever happened next was out of his hands. Later that night, after the press conference had ended and the media frenzy had begun, Jonathan and Lucas returned to the mansion. The fire crackled in the hearth as they sat in the living room, the tension between them finally beginning to ease. "You did good today," Lucas said quietly, breaking the silence. Jonathan glanced at him, surprised. "You think so?" Lucas nodded. "You owned up to it. Not many people would." Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just hope it was enough." Lucas was silent for a moment, then spoke again, his voice softer this time. "It'll never be enough to fix everything, Jonathan, but it's a start." Jonathan looked at Lucas, gratitude swelling in his chest. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Lucas. I know I don't deserve it." Lucas leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Maybe you don't," he said slowly, "but I'm willing to try. We've both been through hell, and maybe, just maybe, we can come out of this with something worth rebuilding." Jonathan's chest tightened with emotion. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was hope. And for the first time in years, Jonathan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible. As the night wore on, the two men sat in the quiet, the weight of their past slowly lifting, replaced by the possibility of a future neither of them had thought possible. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt something close to peace.